What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Thoughts with Nick. When you think about the world and the state of affairs today, how does it make you feel? Are you willing to accept things as they are and tolerate the status quo, or do you feel like it's time for a change, but you're not really sure where to begin? I certainly fall into the latter category. I believe that as a society, we're long overdue for a change. However, when I think about where to start, I can get a little overwhelmed. I want to explore this subject a bit today, specifically my belief that the feeling of powerlessness we get as individuals when we think about large-scale change serves to the benefit of the entrenched power structure, and that we need to escape this mindset in order to bring the future that we want into fruition. As always, I'm going to get started with the quote. Today's quote is a series of lyrics from the song Change by J. Cole. At the beginning, he says, "My intuition is telling me there will be better days." Then in the middle on the hook, "I know you're desperate for a change at the pen glide, but the only real change comes from inside." Then at the end, "Life is all about the evolution. You can dream, but don't neglect the execution. Time is short, that's what somebody told me. Too short to keep following your homies." And once again, that's Change by J. Cole. I would highly recommend giving it a listen. I want to start with the middle part, the hook. "I know you're desperate for a change at the pen glide, but the only real change comes from inside." I believe this very directly hits upon where the sense of powerlessness comes from in a lot of people today. What J. Cole is referring to there, I think, is an executive order in which at the pen glide, at the president's signature, his word becomes law. Quite literally, a change is made at the pen glide. A lot of people, not quite as many in my generation, but still, a lot of people count on politics and politicians to create the changes that they want to see in the world. They truly believe that the person that they vote for or the party that they align themselves with is going to create change when they get into power or get into office. So when that doesn't occur, it can be very disheartening, discouraging, and demoralizing. I can see it easily leaving people wondering why they even wasted their time voting when the person that they voted for, the person that they believed in, wasn't able to do anything that they said they were going to do. Kind of just leaves you wondering, what was the point? And do I really have any power as an individual if the person that I cast my vote for literally did nothing they said they were going to do? It's inherently demoralizing, is it not? I think a great example that we can look to for some contemporary contextualization can be found within American politics in the past 20 years. When we look at the past 20 years, first of all, I'm specifically using that time frame because I'm in my early 20s, so I can remember the presidents who were in office during that year with relative clarity, right? So first of all, we have Obama in 2008. Then Trump in 2016, followed by Biden in 2020, and then Trump again in 2024. If we think about the platforms that these candidates ran on, we have Obama, whose slogan was hope and change, change being a clear word and primary focal point of his entire campaign, followed by Trump, whose main deal in 2016 was drain the swamp, a change in order to eliminate or remove the bureaucracy. Then Biden in 2020, who mainly ran on being a change from Trump and Trump's policies and the direction Trump was taking the country. And then finally, Trump again in 2024, whose main campaign promises were changing the focus back to America rather than a more global focus. So as I mentioned, we have about 20 years of contemporary history right there, relatively recent up to the present. And when we look at the aggregate, how much has really changed? I'm sure you could get nitpicky and come up with a handful of examples, as could I, but I'm talking about large-scale change. Not a lot has really occurred that we can look back at this time period and say, wow, things are radically different than they were when George Bush was president, right? That's just not really the case. We're still fighting these foreign wars. Our civil liberties are continuing to be, eroded as time goes on, right? So once again, this can be very demoralizing because you look at the years going by, damn near 2 decades, and what's really changed for the better. Anyway, my point here is that we can't count on these politicians and politics as a whole to create the change that we want to see in the world. We have to count on ourselves. As J. Cole said, the only real change comes from inside. I believe that this sense of powerlessness that we get from seeing the failure to deliver on these political promises is exactly what allows the current power structure to continue to exist and thrive. And what I mean by that is the current power structure not only consists of the existing branches of government, but there's also an entrenched bureaucracy and a financial ruling class. When I say those things, I understand that it can sound a little conspiratorial, but the fact of the matter is that it's not. I try to base my perspectives and opinions in objectivity and logic. So if we look at what I just mentioned through an objective and logical lens, we can see that there is, in fact, an entrenched bureaucracy. There are people in Washington and in the various governmental departments who have remained in their post for countless presidents. Their tenure has spanned who knows how many years. They might have been there since before even the 2000s. They've seen countless presidents come and go, and yet they maintain their position. And I'm not saying that this is inherently a bad thing, but there is a level of problematicness to that situation because these people are only there I don't want to say they're only there, but there is a portion of them who are only there to advance their own interests. They're not acting in alignment with the president who, if we look at it as things are supposed to be, of course, this is a little idealistic. Things aren't necessarily how they're supposed to be, but the president is supposed to act on the will of the people, right? So if the entrenched bureaucracy is not acting on the will of the president, by extension, they're not acting on the will of the people. So there you see, I feel like that kind of proves my point that the entrenched bureaucracy is a problem, and when we have this feeling of powerlessness that we can never change that, they continue to thrive and double down on their existing power because they get almost like an additional boost to their power because they have an understanding that we feel we can't do anything to change the current state of existence, right? And then the secondary piece of that is the financial ruling class. This is, I want to say, a little bit more malevolent, and I think it's really come to light in recent years. So how a lot of these people operate is through super PACs in which they'll fund the campaigns and politicians that they want in power. However, if there's any deviation from the ideological lines that these billionaires want the candidates to follow, the money dries up, and thus the advertising and media dries up as well. Their exposure dwindles down to nothing, and it's very difficult for them to actually make a name for themselves and continue to advance their campaign forward without the funding and backing of this financial ruling class, this financial elites. So once again, just like the bureaucracy, these people thrive on our feeling and sentiment that we can't do anything to hurt their power, that we can't do anything to change the way that things are. So in order to actually make a difference, the first step is to cultivate a level of belief within ourselves, which is exactly what J. Cole said. The only real change comes from inside. Real change is always going to start with us. And interestingly enough, I think this directly relates to one of the Hermetic principles, which is the law of correspondence. And what the law of correspondence is more familiarly known as above, so below, as within, so without. And what that means, if that's not already obvious enough, is that internal reflects the external. So if we can live a more harmonious existence within ourselves, be more in line with truth, and cultivate a higher level of, life in general for ourselves as individuals, the external reality has no choice but to bend and acquiesce to that internal state, because the internal is reflected externally, right? And of course, it's not going to be one person magically changes themselves and now society as a whole is better. No, there's 8 billion plus of us. So it's going to take a lot of people to change themselves internally for this change to take place externally. But nonetheless, I believe that that's, how things can work. And without too much external manipulation, we can actually enact a large amount of change simply by focusing inward and making sure that we're living right and living a harmonious existence, right? So anyway, getting back to the point, as I said, the real change has to be internal, but in that same breath, humans are inherently averse to change. Change seems very desirable, and people love to talk about doing things different and making all these changes and adjustments and whatnot. And it sounds great when it's on the horizon, but when that day comes and it's right in front of you, it's really easy to fall back and default to what you already know. And this is exactly why the aversion to change is inherent within us, because change implies a level of uncertainty and an element of unknown, whereas not changing is known, right? You already know what the outcome or the situation is going to be if you don't change, because it's the existence that you're already living within. It's the framework that you're already familiar with, versus something new. It could be worse for all you know. If nothing else, it's going to be unknown. So there's a level of risk that is inherent to that unknown nature of taking that step and taking the risk, right? So as I said, I believe that's why as individuals we are inherently averse to change, no matter how much we act like we want to. And just to give an example from my own life, you might say, Nick, that's trivial, right? That's super minor. But regardless, I want to give an example of my own life where I've been failing to change despite the knowledge of how much better actually making the change would be. So I'm not getting my 10,000 steps in every day. It's a well-known number that if you hit 10,000 steps a day, there's all these other health benefits that coincide with that. I've been trying, but I haven't been trying quite hard enough. I've been setting my alarm a little bit earlier in the morning than I need to wake up, in hopes that I'll be able to get my ass out of bed and go on a walk before I have to go to work, so I can get closer to eclipsing that 10,000 steps on a daily basis. But what do? I hit snooze. I can't change. Well, that's exactly what I'm trying to say that we shouldn't say. I can change, but I'm choosing not to. I'm failing to change, and for me, there's no uncertainty in this situation. I'm just being lazy, so I got to kind of rise above that. But regardless, I just wanted to give an example from my own life about an aversion to change that I deal with on a daily basis, and I haven't been able to overcome it yet. And it just shows, it really personifies how in our daily lives we have these instances where we can choose to change or choose to remain the same. And oftentimes it's so much easier to remain the same, regardless of how much better the change is going to be in the long run. Taking that to the next level, I want to transpose the individual aversion to change onto institutions. An institution is nothing more than a combination and coagulation of countless individuals. So the inherent aversion to change that's a part of human nature is baked into institutions because they're nothing more than a coming together of countless individuals. Institutions are created by individuals, and when they create the institutions, their individual aversion to change as a result goes into the institution and is further cultivated as more and more individuals cycle through and are added to the institution. So, as I mentioned, with the individual aversion to change, it can be overcome with relative ease, but an institutional aversion to change is much more difficult to overcome because of the gravity of said institution. And I think this can be explained very well with something from the world of physics, specifically one of the laws of motion. So, what we have from Sir Isaac Newton is an object at rest will stay at rest unless acted upon by an outside force. And this can be applied to individuals or institutions. You're not going to change as an individual unless you get the impetus or catalyst to actually make the change. Without an inspiration to change, how can a change ever take place? It never occurred to you to make a change. And that inspiration, that catalyst, that impetus is the external force acting upon you to, get you moving and actually end up making the change. And likewise, this can be applied to the institutions as well. They'll never change without an outside force acting upon them, creating the change. However, in the case of the institutions, the outside force has to be much larger because the institutions have a much greater mass than an individual. It requires a much greater force because the mass of the institution is so great. It's pressing down semi-permanently in place, and it has to be turned over on its side and turned over again and again. But that's not going to ever happen without a great deal of external force continuing to press upon it until it has no choice except to begin to rotate. So just an example there of consilience in which something that we know and understand from the world of physics can be applied fairly directly to the social sciences. And to give an example, an institutional example from my life as well, once again, small when we think of federal and global institutions, but nonetheless something that I interact with on a daily basis, and it does have a large impact greater than just me. About a year ago at my work, we implemented a new ERP system, which stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. And this system encompasses all aspects of our business, from manufacturing to sales to accounting to inventory management and warehousing. All of those different things are rolled up into this one system, and the implementation really brought us into the 21st century as a company. It was a major revelation, and it was great, right? Of course, I'm going to be an advocate for it because I'm in the IT department, so I was a part of this project. But nonetheless, I can say objectively that there were great benefits to the completion of this project. But throughout the duration and the time period leading up to and following the implementation, there was a ton of aversion, resistance, complaints, difficulty when it came to actually moving it live. People were very, very resistant to get on board and very hesitant to accept and endorse the new system, regardless of the fact that there were countless flaws and issues with the old system that they, were able to bypass and work around because they were so accustomed to doing their job in a certain way. They were used to doing things one way. It was known, it was familiar to them, despite the things that might have been a bit complicated or tedious. They knew how to do it, so it wasn't necessarily an issue to them, even though it wasn't right, if that makes sense. So the new system was going to reduce some of those complications, but there was an inherent learning curve baked in because it was unfamiliar, because it was new, and because it was different, right? So a lot of the people were quite averse to this and gave a lot of pushback throughout the journey. And I want to be clear. I'm not saying this to reflect upon them negatively. I'm just using it as a contemporary example from my own life, which shows and speaks to the institutional aversion to change, which I experienced. And now things are quite different. A lot of people have good things to say about this system because they've seen it benefit their individual tasks that they have to accomplish on a daily basis. And, you know, it's kind of funny in retrospect how averse a great number of people were when we can see the benefits that have come to fruition just a year removed from the implementation, right? And I don't want to continue to harp on this work example, but I think it does provide a great amount of context to how institutions can develop an aversion to change as a collective, and it can make it difficult to actually get over the hump when there's a general sentiment of resistance within. So anyway, continuing to move forward, what I want to get into now and kind of close out the remaining portion of the video with is how we can actually begin to create change. So back to the quote, the lyrics. What J. Cole says is, "My intuition is telling me there will be better days." And I already kind of covered the middle section, but anyway. "I know you're desperate for a change at the pen glide, but the only real change comes from inside." And then, "Life is all about the evolution. You can dream, but don't neglect the execution. Time is short, that's what somebody told me. Too short to keep following your homies." So, my intuition is telling me there will be better days. There's better days to come. I don't necessarily know when they will be, but I know that they're coming. And then if we look at the back end of the quote, "Life is all about the evolution. You can dream, but don't neglect the execution." Your intuition is telling you there will be better days, but you can't neglect the execution to bring the better days into fruition. Your intuition is telling you this, but you can't just continue to rely on it in some abstract fashion. You have to do the inner work. You have to actually make those changes internally to bring the better days into fruition. Life is all about the evolution. You can dream, but don't neglect the execution. The evolution is the inner work into the better days that your intuition is telling you about. But the execution is the inner work that's required of you to reach the evolution and thus the better days, right? I don't know. I love that song because I feel like that's just so profound. And I hope I did a good job of breaking it down. I feel like that's exactly what J. Cole was trying to say. Of course, this is my subjective interpretation of his lyrics, but I feel like that's really what he was going for there. And this is exactly what my point is, that in order to create change, we have to first start with ourselves, whether that be eating better, whether that be getting in better shape. With me, maybe I need to go and do my 10,000 steps. That's a way that I could change myself that I'm not doing right now. You know, there's other aspects of change, whether that be something like personal finance, whether that be trying to eliminate complaining and cultivating a more positive mindset. All of these things are ways that you can change yourself internally, which are going to continue to benefit you on a day-to-day basis and improve your worldview and your experience in the way that you interface with the world. The next step, building upon that, and this can also be done coinciding with your internal changes, is to find a peer group that's on the same journey with you and that is somewhat like-minded, because this is only going to be able to heighten your personal growth, right? If you have other peers that you can look to when you're having those hard days, when it's hard to do the inner work, when it's hard to stay on the path and the journey that you're walking down, you can look to your peers and say, you know what? If he's fighting this battle too, then why would I back down? You know, he's staying strong. I can lean on him and he can be my inspiration for today so that I don't fold and I don't falter. And it makes it so much easier to continue to go through the challenges and advance down the path when you have other people that you know are walking it with you. And in that same respect, it also makes it easier to kind of work through some of the ideas and plans and things that you want to do and things that you want to see when you have other people to talk about them with. And I can relate to this very acutely because I'm I'm an idealist at heart, and I like to kind of temper my idealism in realism. So I'll have an idealist idea and I'll border it in realism so that it's not too idealist and too abstract to actually ever be brought into the material world in a functional and realistic way. Because if it's too ideal, it's just going to be broken and corrupted when it gets brought into reality. So there has to be an element of realism baked in and weaved in throughout, or it's never going to work, right? It's just simply too high-minded not to be like, I don't know, whatever. But anyway, when you have other people around you, you can say, man, I was thinking about this. What do you think about that? And they'll say, yeah, dude, I don't know if you fully thought about that in a well-rounded way. And just, they can poke holes in it and say, what if this happened? What if somebody tried to do that? And you can say, you know what? Yeah, I didn't think of it from that perspective. And if somebody were to do that, they could really undermine the entire system and corrupt it in a way that would really make it not worth even implementing in the first place, right? So that's just an example of how having a peer group to go on this journey with you will help you to stay the course. It'll also help you to develop the ideas that you have, develop your ideologies, your thought processes into a more well-rounded fashion that they can actually be executed and implemented in a way that isn't going to fail because it wasn't well thought out. The next step, once you have a peer group, is to kind of continue to build this group into a collective and a community. And, as the old adage says, there's strength in numbers. There's strength in unity. So when you are able to create a collective, then you can really start to make some noise. You can really get some power behind your words and a strong, united voice, which will be able to create change. You can maybe communicate with local politicians and local government in your community and help to enact the things that you want to see and do in your community, whatever that may be. Something that I think about, which seems somewhat small and trivial, but it has an everyday effect, is something like potholes on the bypass. People hit those every day. Some people might pop their tires. In general, it just kind of creates a lessened and more negative driving experience and commute on the daily drive back and forth to work. So if you had a collective group behind you, or with you rather, to communicate to whoever that may be, PennDOT or something like that, to say, hey, listen, we need to get this taken care of and it needs to be done soon because this is not right and it's really impacting a lot of people, so on and so forth. Then with the strength of your word as a collective, they'll be somewhat obligated to act on that because you're putting pressure on them and you're saying, look, we're watching you. We're seeing your delay in action and we know that you should be doing this, but you're not. So, more often than not, I think holding people accountable for their actions is what can help actually make changes take place. So when you have a greater number of people letting a party know that we see what you're doing and we're calling you out for it, we're holding you accountable, this is more likely to actually create the change in a timely fashion. So, like I said, the steps kind of go from an individual change and a change in your own life to a peer group who you can hold each other accountable and count on each other and then bounce ideas off of each other, to a larger collective, which is really what I'm trying to do with this YouTube thing here. Develop a group of cultivate a group of like-minded individuals where we can go back and forth with each other in the comments section. You can let me know what you think about my ideas and whether or not they're too idealistic or whatever the case may be. And I can continue to develop my own philosophies in a way that is more tangible and more realistic to be brought into the real world, right? Like, that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. And then from the next step, when you have that collective, you can start to actually try and bring those ideas into fruition. And then from there, you can continue to build upon it further and further into things, like I said, whether that be local government or whether that be actual, political change. So anyway, what I'll close with for today is, don't give up. Don't think that you have no power. That's how these entrenched structures continue to thrive and and coalesce the power that they already have even further, right? You have to believe that you can make a change in order for that to actually be realistic in the first place. So believe in yourself, believe in others, and do what you can to change yourself before you try and change anything out in the external world. Focus on yourself first, and then try and find some people who are on the same journey with you. And from there, I think you'll be surprised what you're able to achieve. Remember the law of correspondence. The external will respond to the internal. So if we can all make these changes together and continue to grow and improve ourselves as time goes on, I think you'll be surprised to see the benefits that take place in the external world. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you'll stay on this journey with me as we try and do what we can to bring the future that we want into fruition. And one day it'll be there. One day it'll be there, and we'll look back and say, man, I remember 20 years ago, back when I was in my 20s, the world, it wasn't as good as it is today. And me and my generation, we made it this way. We brought it into this future that you can pass off to your kids and be proud of. So that's what we want for the world. That's what I want for the world. I want to be able to look back and be proud of my contributions and the contributions of the peers in my generation. So let's try and make that a reality, everybody. Let's do what we can. And I think it can be done. So anyway, like I said, thanks for tuning in, and let's get to it. Let's get it going. Let's bring this future into fruition, and let's make these changes happen rather than sitting back and thinking that it can't be done. Let's believe that it can, and let's do it.